Okay, so I've got my mom here on FaceTime. Hopefully she can participate as well. But I'm about to tell you a story about forgiveness. It's also a story about revenge. It's also a story about the crucible, which is a very hot vessel in which the worthless is melted away, leaving behind what's worthwhile. In 2010, I was 23 years old and found myself clutching the podium in a courtroom in the 9th District Court in California. Really, the past 4 months having spent every morning in that space before you open your eyelids thinking, oh, thank God, that was the worst dream I have ever had. And opening my eyes, only to realize that I was surrounded by other inmates watching TV or playing cards or whatever it was they were doing there a foot from my bunk. Just living in complete disbelief that I had found myself from a place of relative stability and comfort and volunteerism and experimenting with entrepreneurism and such, and just being flung to some random federal holding facility in San Diego. And as I stood there in that courtroom, I was just not believing. I could hear my mother behind me sobbing, in the background. She had flown out there to watch some years of her son's life be cleaved away by the U.S. Attorney General's office. And the judge, he swung down his gavel and called order to the court. And in rather uncharacteristic fashion, he started the proceedings by saying, before anything else, I'd like to really commend Miss Franklin for putting together the most extensive sentencing memorandum I've ever received in my years here as a judge in the 9th District Court. And as I've read it thoroughly, and as such, I am inclined to believe that the offense committed was a complete aberration to the nature of the defendant. And as such, I see fit to grant Mr. Roussel time served for his 4 months here at the Metropolitan Correction Facility. And there was just like this huge sigh of relief, like that was a virtually unprecedented downward departure from the otherwise very deterministic and formulaic system of the federal government sentencing guidelines. What he didn't mention was that actually that memorandum was actually the work and effort of many of the people that are sitting in this very room, and Cory herself having written a very well put together, well thought out 3-page letter to the judge pleading for leniency. And so it was like this huge victory. I just couldn't believe it. Truly, this is very rare outside of cooperation, of course, which there was really nothing to cooperate on in this issue. Everyone else was across the border or whatever. So I have received 4 months, expecting in full 3 years mandatory minimum for aiding and abetting a person to enter the United States without presentation. And they told me that as a part of my sentence, I would serve 3 years probation and 6 months with an ankle bracelet. And that it would be no big deal. Everyone has to do it. Just go through the motions and keep your nose clean, whatever, and it'll be fine. And then after your 6 months with the ankle bracelet, you can move back out of your parents' house in Baton Rouge to your home in Austin and reconnect with all these wonderful people that have written on your behalf. And I just breathed a sigh of relief. But I had this nagging apprehension in the back of my head, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And that first week there in Baton Rouge, I met with the probation office, and they promptly informed me that I would not be going back to Austin. I would be living where they told me to, which was in Baton Rouge, because that's where I had my family ties, even though I didn't grow up there, I'm not from there. And they commenced to tell me that they owned me, and that they were going to tell me who I could associate with, where I could work, where I could spend my money. Everything was their command. And with that came resentment. And I could not believe the audacity of these people. How could any person willingly deny someone returning to their home, returning to some semblance of normalcy, and do so and still go to sleep at night? And it was as though they had reclaimed that great monumental victory that had just occurred the week before. And for that, I deeply resented them. The next year was a story of falling deeper and deeper into misunderstanding and resentment, and eventually rebellion. And as wise Jedi Master Yoda once said, fear turns to anger, and anger turns to hatred, and hatred turns to war. And so I declared personal war on the probation department there in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And they had me doing all kinds of crazy things. I mean, they had me going to these different classes in vocational rehabilitation and psychological assessments, some of which lasting as long as 8 hours of ink blot tests and poking my face and asking me what just happened and all sorts of, I'm serious, it's really weird stuff. You know, they were doing these experiments, the most egregious of which was a test that they gave me called a risk assessment test, and it's a test developed by IBM, and it is the weirdest thing. You answer these questions and it spits out a percentage chance that they will revoke your probation and send you back to prison. And out came 67% chance of returning me to prison. And I'm just looking at them thinking, are you for real? Like, you're giving me a test that predicts what decision you're going to make, whether or not you're going to give me prison time for not breaking any laws, but not quite doing what you said. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it seemed like injustice in the truest sense of the word. And with that, my hatred grew and my resentment just grew and brooded within me, and my world became hate, truly. I mean, and I knew I needed to let go of that. I could feel it just sapping my energy away in every which way. But I couldn't seem to muster up the strength to rise above it. And it eventually culminated in them taking me from the apartment that I had recently secured and telling me that I had to live in this halfway house in an area known as the Top in Baton Rouge, an area that has the dubious distinction of, at various points in the past decade, being the highest per capita murder rate in the nation. And they got me a job, thank you for giving me this job for your other probationer, where I would have to walk in my dress clothes, it's a sales position, of course, a mile and a half through the Top, all the while hoping that one of the bullets, like the one that had taken the life of another resident as he stepped right outside the door of the halfway house, or the bullets that had just 6 months prior penetrated that lobby, wouldn't one day claim my life as well, And I just couldn't believe, what are these people thinking? Now, in their defense, these people actually, I believe, are good-hearted, honest, patriotic Americans that are simply trying to do their job. The problem, of course, being that you can't help someone through coercion and threats. You can't help someone with some stupid risk assessment based on some statistics about God knows what. They really, I felt as though they were standing next to me, holding the cord of a guillotine, just threatening me. And they made a point to regularly remind me that my freedom and of their prerogative to send me back to the hell that I felt I had just narrowly escaped. With that, I just kind of spiraled downward deeper and deeper into this just disgusting place, and my world lost color, started to become monochrome. And it was really, truly like this crushing boulder weight. I felt like I couldn't breathe. And what happened is the one person who stayed with me proactively, not to say that anyone in this room wouldn't have been willing to be there for me had I been, unashamedness to ask for it. She really stood there by me through this, even when I was the most unpleasant of persons to be around, as you can imagine. And she reached out to her sister, and they began praying, actually, completely unbeknownst to me. I had no idea they were doing this. 3 days later, I woke up and suddenly found the courage to forgive the probation department, my probation officers, all these other people that I lived with in that ghetto there, all these people that I had frequent altercations with and everything. Somehow I had been granted the precious gift of forgiving them and of accepting that situation. But it turned out it had been too late. The gears had already begun to turn on my revocation. And 3 days later, some U.S. Marshals came in and said, "Listen, Mr. Roussel, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You can gather your possessions quietly and prepare yourself to go back to prison, or we can bust the teeth out of your mouth, throw your shit away, and take you to prison nonetheless." So needless to say, I gathered my little possessions and stuff and kind of stashed them away. And I remember sitting there in that courthouse in the federal court of Middle District of Louisiana, just with an ear-to-ear smile, knowing that there was absolutely nothing they could do to me to take away my peace that I had felt. And knowing not only was I at peace, but I was going to transmute, however long it was that they were going to give me, this sentence into an opportunity for personal growth and for sharing. And my first cellmate, I will never forget him because he's now my best friend. I talk to him almost every day. Also named Cory. That's another story. Anyways, we decided to do 4 things over that year. One of them was to meditate and to really take the opportunity in withdrawal from society to meditate. The second was to listen to these people. You want to talk about authentic connection? Okay, try meeting someone who just found out that they're losing the next 30 years of their life, or losing their life altogether because the federal government wasn't capable of, treating them for whatever terminal illness it was, and now they're looking at 20 years. We turned our cell into sort of like an ashram, a forum, a classroom, and like a psychotherapist chair. We would invite anyone that wanted to escape the cacophony of obscenities and card games and dominoes outside and come share something constructive. We invited them into our cells, and by the day we listened to other people. In the evenings we'd meditate, and then at night we would write, and we would write and write and write, and sometimes we would write during lights out when the 2 oppressively bright fluorescent bulbs, one of them went out, so that you could get some sleep supposedly, and we would use this to our advantage, and we would write through the night, and we would correspond. The third thing that we did is Socrates once said, the unexamined life is a life not worth living. So we really took this opportunity to reflect and to comprehensively enumerate strengths, weaknesses, resentments, experiences, axioms to live by, all these things, past, present, future, put them down on paper, solidify those thoughts so that they could be worked with and looked at intentionally. And the 4th thing that we did is we shared seeds. We collected seeds from Viktor Frankl and from Gandhi and anything we could get our hands on. A book on sacred geometry or Bo Lozoff, we're all doing. Anything, Reuben Hurricane, anything inspirational, we'd invite in we would invite in the Islamic extremists or the racist extremists or whoever it was. We'll listen to what you have to say, and we're going to compare it to what we have and open a dialogue. So we collected these seeds, and we shared them in correspondence. Half of that is correspondence to friends and family. And we sought to be guerrilla gardeners of our own minds. And that's what I did for the next year. And even though I was eventually, the federal government, as Ted probably knows, likes to keep its inmates unsettled. So they moved them around quite a bit. And they moved me from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans to the tarmac to prepare for a Conair flight, which is a pretty funny thing to see. It's kind of reminiscent of what I would imagine slave trade of days past to have been. You know, all these armed men standing around in a circle and shuffling these inmates in shackles into formation and then kind of trading them off onto these different prison buses and then shuffling some of them onto the airplane. I'll never forget the image of a fully tattooed gangster that had survived multiple prison riots and, you know, being shot and stabbed, just shaking, fearing for his life because he'd never flown on a plane before. And we're sitting down there looking at the Grand Canyon, you know, as we hopscotched, you know, they hopscotch you all day throughout the country until you finally end up somewhere, you know, where you're headed, nobody knows. To Oklahoma and then eventually San Diego. And I spent the rest of that time doing exactly that, writing, collecting seeds, and doing something that eventually developed into the 7-page project, which is basically just a call to be prepared to write a letter to a general audience. For me, I have written a 7-page project for other prisoners, that they might take the seeds that enabled me to overcome that situation. And don't get me wrong, there were still a lot of close calls. It was still a very violent place. There, you know, somehow I made it out virtually unscathed. But really a call to examine. If you consider yourself a principled person who stands for something so that they won't fall for anything, then I argue that it is your due diligence, it is your duty to put those things down onto paper. Now the 7-page project is just a nice excuse to collect 7 pages to prepare for a general audience. So perhaps it's for your progeny. You write the axioms and quotes that you live by, and you are prepared to give back in that way, just as I'm prepared to give back to any prisoner these seeds of strength that made it through. And as far as the revenge thing, it's been said that the best revenge is living well. So I hope that one day some of those probation officers and correctional officers will hear this story and they'll rest assured that I am exacting my revenge day by day here in Austin, Texas, our little paradise with my little community here that I really owe the world for having really put forth so much effort to free me. And even though it didn't work out as we all thought that it would, and it seemed desperate and hopeless, that was transmuted through the crucible into something priceless. That's all I got. So I just received this belated birthday present entitled Book of Truths by me, actually. My mom took my 7-page project and turned it into this book. And it's quite interesting. So I guess how many people write a book and didn't know it?